Our story begins with Sam, who drew his teacher, Professor Fiona, as the lead in a manga and did whatever he pleased with her character. But he never imagined that she would eventually become his most loyal fan. He assumed she would never discover his little secret, but a sudden accident forced him to live with her. On graduation day, out of pure curiosity, he somehow forgot to hand in his final graduation materials. This meant he had to ask the professor for her address and deliver the documents directly to her home. Following the directions she gave him, he found the complex and took the elevator up to the fifth floor. He eventually located room 502, the place where his unexpected journey would truly begin. With the graduation documents in hand, he took a deep breath and knocked on the door. He called out, telling Professor Fiona that it was Sam and he was there to deliver the paperwork. From inside the room, a pleasant female voice drifted out to meet him. She told him she couldn't let go of what she was holding and to come right in, as the door wasn't locked. He gave a quick, startled response, blinked, and opened the door to room 502. The place where Fiona lives appears to be a fairly sizable rental apartment. It was about 1,000 square feet, featuring 3 bedrooms and a spacious living room. As he stepped inside, a scent very characteristic of Professor Fiona immediately filled the air. The fragrance hit him instantly as he moved further into the room. Deep down, he felt he might end up trapped here, doubting he would be going home anytime soon. Arriving at midday, every detail around him clearly indicated that this was a woman's private space. He called out for the professor, and there in the bedroom, Fiona had just finished tidying up her things. She was sitting on the bed, deeply engrossed in a romance manga where a teacher was confessing her love. She watched as the character confessed her feelings to the male lead on a rainy day. Naturally, she assumed a kiss scene would surely follow such a moment. The manga she was currently reading was the work of a brand new author. It was titled The Season of Eternal Graduation, a name that felt oddly fitting. Fiona had been following this particular story for quite some time now. At first, she liked it because the author wrote with great sensitivity and the plot was remarkably heartwarming. However, as she read further, Fiona began to notice something rather peculiar. It seemed more and more that the teacher in the manga, the female lead, was familiar. The character shared her gestures and even her style of dress, despite being only two-dimensional. She could still spot several similarities, so while reading, she unintentionally began to identify with her. This strange sensation completely piqued her interest, which, to be honest, was quite understandable. As a result, she checked for updates every single week like the dedicated fan she was. We see that the development of the manga's plot wasn't exactly fast-paced. In this week's update, the two characters had finally confessed their love in the rain. But just as Fiona was becoming completely hooked on the scene and waiting for what happened next, the climax was cut short right then and there. The chapter ended with the dreaded notice that the story would continue next week. A look of slight annoyance crossed Fiona's face at the poorly timed cliffhanger. She closed her computer and left the bedroom, feeling a certain sense of lingering dissatisfaction. Seeing Sam standing at the door, she smiled and asked if he had arrived quickly. She asked if he had brought all the documents, and Sam confirmed that he had everything ready. Sam approached Fiona and handed the papers directly to her so she could take a look. He explained that these were the official files for both himself and his classmate, Charlie. He had intended to give them to her earlier that morning, but it had completely slipped his mind. Fiona took the 2 student files, skimmed through them briefly, and began to murmur her thoughts. She noted that Sam was usually quite careful, wondering why he had been so disorganized this time. It was fortunate, she added, that these particular documents weren't considered urgent. Otherwise, it would have been a real problem, and she warned him and Charlie to be more mindful. She advised them not to make a habit of losing things once they started their professional careers. Sam knew a lecture was coming, so he simply nodded and promised to be more attentive. He assured her that from now on, they would certainly pay much closer attention to such details. Fiona looked at him with a deep, lingering expression that seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Out of all her students, we see that Sam was the one who had made the strongest impression on her. After all, they had shared a chance encounter involving a stray cat at the very start of the semester. She told him to leave the items with her, noting that he was free to go for the day. She mentioned she would post the date for the diploma ceremony in the class group chat later. Sam said his goodbyes, but just as he was leaving, Fiona stopped him with a sudden question. She asked if he planned to stay and work in the city after graduation or return to his hometown. Sam admitted he planned to stay, as there weren't many suitable job opportunities back home. Fiona nodded, telling him to work hard and reminding him that she truly believed in his potential. "Be careful on your way home," she added, and Sam thanked Professor Fiona as he turned to leave. But just as he was about to open the door and make his exit, the world outside intervened. The elevator doors suddenly slid open, and a group of people in white hazmat suits stepped out into the hallway. Seeing him about to leave, they stopped him immediately to deliver some rather unexpected news. They explained that due to a positive case found during that morning's screening, the entire complex was being flagged. This residential area was being placed under temporary quarantine, meaning no one would be allowed to enter or leave. It was a sudden lockdown, to say the least. They then asked if he belonged to apartment 502. They needed to conduct a head count and asked him exactly how many people were currently staying in the home. Sam was caught completely off guard, wondering if he had heard correctly about the building being sealed off. He tried to explain that he was only there to drop something off and didn't actually live in the building. The worker was apologetic but firm, asking for his understanding as they were simply following protocol. He suggested that Sam stay temporarily with his friend until the situation was resolved. It was for the safety of the community, they said, leaving Sam standing there in utter disbelief. The commotion at the front door soon caught the attention of Fiona, who was still inside the apartment. She walked over to the entrance, her eyes widening at the sight of the workers in their protective suits. She was just as stunned as Sam was. Fiona asked them what exactly was going on. The worker in white patiently repeated the explanation he had just given to the young man. He greeted her politely and informed her that a case had been detected in the complex that morning. Because of this, a temporary lockdown was in effect and no one would be permitted to come or go for a while. They were now finalizing the head count and asked her how many residents were currently in her home. Just the two of you, Fiona asked, clearly stunned by the sudden turn of events. No one could enter or leave. Instinctively, she turned her head to look at Sam, who stood half a head taller than her. Sam, in turn, looked back at Fiona. They shared a brief, awkward glance before Sam looked back at the worker in embarrassment. How long would this lockdown last? A month, perhaps? To be honest, neither of them knew. If things were serious, it could be 2 or 3 months. It would be a long wait. The worker explained that they would be notified via the residents group once it was lifted. Confirming there were only 2 of them, he warned them not to open the door again. They were told to stay inside and keep the door locked, or they would be in violation. Appropriate measures would be taken otherwise. He then asked for their names and IDs for the lock. Both Fiona and Sam stood there, completely dazed by the speed of it all. With a sense of quiet resignation, they provided the requested information. The worker in the white suit nodded as he finished recording their details. He reminded them to wash their hands, keep the place ventilated, and watch for group updates. Medical staff would be coming by later that evening to conduct mandatory testing. He asked for their full cooperation before telling them to finally close the door. As the door clicked shut, the workers outside continued their grim task. We see them moving down the hall to notify the very next resident. Back inside, our 2 protagonists could only stare at each other in speechless disbelief. Fiona and Sam stood in the silence of the apartment, wondering what would happen next. Overwhelmed by embarrassment, neither of them could find the words to speak. Finally, Sam broke the silence, asking Fiona what they should do now. Fiona frowned, a rare sight for her, as she faced the sudden reality of living inexplicably with a man. Even if he was her own student, Fiona had never allowed a man to live in her home in her entire life. This was a first, and she sighed. Unsure of what to say, she could only cover her forehead and smile with resignation. She told Sam to sit down for a moment while she made a call home. She had originally planned to return to her hometown that very day. Sam told her to go ahead, watching as Fiona turned and headed into the bedroom. He swallowed hard, his mind going almost completely blank in that moment. Deep down, he was filled with nervousness and an indescribable sense of excitement. He was actually going to live with Fiona for the next 2 or 3 months. And what's more, they were trapped inside, with nothing to do but household chores. The situation was so awkward he felt like he could sink through the floor. In a 3-bedroom apartment, he wondered how he was supposed to behave. From the bedroom, the slightly resigned voice of a woman drifted through the air. She greeted her parents, explaining that something completely unexpected had happened. The complex was locked down, and she wouldn't be able to make it home today. It was still unclear when the restrictions would finally be lifted. She assured them she would take care of herself and told them not to worry. All right. You and Dad take care of yourselves then. She promised to keep them updated if anything else changed. Well, I'll hang up now. I need to unpack the things I'd already prepared. Fiona hung up the phone and sat on the bed, remaining silent for a while. She chose not to tell her parents that there was a young man in the house. Being locked in with him felt far too strange and messy to explain, after all. After reflecting for a moment, Fiona went to the bedroom door and looked toward the sofa. Sam was sitting there perfectly still, and she realized they would be living together for several months. To be honest, it felt like a blessing in disguise, because she had been observing this particular student for some time now. He was a caring student, quite mature, and not the type to cause trouble. The idea of having him around didn't bother her. She felt no resistance at all. She turned back, knelt down, and began unpacking the bag she had just finished packing. As she reorganized everything, we see Sam still sitting awkwardly on the sofa. If his best friend hadn't called him right then, he wouldn't have known what to do. It's no exaggeration to say that in Fiona's house, he barely knew how to breathe. He felt like he was walking on eggshells until his friend, Toby, gave him a ring. When Sam answered, he could hear Toby munching on something on the other end. Toby sounded quite casual as he asked, "Hey Sam, did you deliver those documents?" "I did," Sam replied, "but something completely unexpected happened over here." Sam explained that he probably wouldn't be able to return. Toby, sounding curious, asked what he meant by that. He wondered if the counselor was so angry that after scolding Sam, she wanted Toby to come over and receive a reprimand as well. "No, it's not that," Sam replied. Toby then asked if he had been in a car accident. Sam dismissed the idea, but Toby couldn't imagine what other unforeseen event it could be. "You're quite a character," Toby joked. "Anyway, after you deliver those documents, get over here quickly. I've already got your spot ready for you, and if you don't arrive soon, Well, if you don't show up, I'll eat it all myself. Sam told him to go ahead. It was all his. He explained that the counselor's area had been sealed off, and he'd have to live with her for a while. At that moment, Toby, who was still chatting away on the phone, was completely stunned by the news, and the meat he was chewing suddenly lost its flavor. What are you saying? You're locked in with our counselor. Are you actually in her house right now? Are you serious? He couldn't believe how such a strange thing could happen to his friend. Do you think I'm joking? Sam asked. He was so nervous, he didn't know whether to sit or stand. Toby thought it was incredible, but suddenly, Sam heard the sound of objects falling from Fiona's bedroom, followed by her scream. He looked toward the door and told his friend he would call back later that night, as something seemed to have happened to the counselor. He went to see what was wrong and found Fiona standing on tiptoe on top of a small box. She seemed to be trying to put a suitcase in the closet, but in that moment, we see Fiona holding the suitcase with trembling hands, visibly tilted as the zipper seemed to have broken, causing clothes and personal items to spill onto the floor the moment she saw him. Fiona, clearly enduring sharp pain in her wrist, called out to Sam for help. She told him she thought she'd sprained her wrist, and seeing this, Sam rushed over immediately. He told her he was coming, and upon reaching her side, he took the heavy suitcase so she could finally lower her arms, step down from the small box, and sit on the bed while rubbing her painful wrist. He set the heavy suitcase down on the floor and looked at Fiona, who was sitting on the bed with her brow furrowed in pain. He asked if she was all right, and she insisted she was fine. She admitted it hurt, but claimed it wasn't serious, suggesting he go rest in the living room instead. She told him if he got bored, he could watch TV, noting the remote was by the sofa while she cleaned up the mess. Seeing her personal items scattered on the floor, Sam realized he couldn't really help with the tidying. So he simply nodded and told her to let him know if she needed help with the suitcase later. Fiona smiled and thanked him as he left the room. To be honest, she was putting on a brave face. Once alone, she rubbed her wrist and sighed quietly. When the sharp pain subsided a bit, she knelt back down to gather the out-of-season clothes that had fallen and began stuffing them back into the suitcase. Meanwhile, Sam was sitting on the sofa in the living room, turning on the television. Although he appeared to be watching a show, in reality, he was waiting for Fiona to call him, with all his attention focused on any sound from the bedroom. He didn't have to wait long, as a few minutes later, her pleasant voice drifted out to him. She asked if he could come help her, and he responded instantly as he headed back to the bedroom. We see that Fiona had already finished tidying up her things. Sam asked if he should put the suitcase back up for her. She thanked him, and without another word, he took the suitcase, stood on his tiptoes, and easily placed it on top of the wardrobe. Fiona watched the scene, well aware of the difference in their strength, and suddenly, she let out a small laugh. She remarked on how strong he was, noting that boys simply have more power, and told him to go watch TV. She mentioned she was going to cook and asked if he liked tomato and eggs. Sam replied that he liked it quite a bit, but he worriedly asked if her hand was all right, even offering to cook himself. She asked if he even knew how to cook. He admitted he knew a little, though he wasn't very good. She smiled, saying that was what she expected, but noted it was good to know the basics. She told him that if he had a girlfriend in the future, he'd be able to take care of her. Insisting her hand was fine, she sent him back to the TV, promising that dinner would be ready soon. Someone once said that time spent in a classroom is what passes the slowest, on average, 10 to 20 times slower than time spent on the weekends. Sam used to believe that too, but today he had changed his mind. As it turns out, sitting in your teacher's house waiting to eat alone with her also makes time crawl by. To be honest, it was a bit much. That slowness even surpassed the boredom of the classroom. Every minute felt like an eternity. Fortunately, after what seemed like a century, Fiona's voice broke that awkward stagnation. She called out to Sam, telling him to get ready to eat. She pointed toward a small room to the right of the entrance to show him where the sink was. Imagine the scene, a quiet apartment and a nervous student. He responded quickly and went to wash his hands. While he was at the sink, he glanced at the shelf and saw nothing but a simple facial cleanser. Come to think of it, when he had been in the bedroom, he noticed there wasn't a vanity or anything of the sort in Fiona's room, which tells you everything you need to know. It seemed this beautiful teacher was truly a natural beauty, one of those rare people who only need a tiny bit of grooming to become the center of attention in any crowd. The two of them sat down together. They sat down at the table, and Fiona handed Sam the utensils with a gentle smile. She had prepared a simple but inviting meal, the steam rising between them in the quiet room. We see that Fiona had put a great deal of effort into the cooking, despite her injured hand. The presentation was surprisingly professional, showing a side of her Sam hadn't seen before. She explained that she usually cooked for herself, but having company made the routine feel entirely different. Sam took a bite, and his eyes widened. She gave a faint, modest smile in return. She admitted that this particular dish was actually one of her personal favorites. It was no wonder she liked it. To be honest, it was absolutely delicious. Fiona picked up her own bowl of rice and began eating the scrambled eggs and tomatoes. Changing the subject, she told him that if he liked it, he should definitely have more. She mentioned that after dinner, she would check the neighborhood group chat for any updates. After all, their current situation was quite unusual, and they needed to know the status of the lockdown. She wanted to see if he could return home, noting she didn't have much extra space. Since she only had one bed, Sam secretly agreed that going home would be the best outcome. Being stuck there felt like a unique kind of torture. Yes, leaving was definitely the right move. Fiona smiled, though the idea of him leaving had only just occurred to her while cooking. She wasn't sure of the rules yet, but promised to ask around even if he couldn't go back. Perhaps she could find him another place to stay nearby for the time being. He felt that would work too. It was certainly better than sitting there awkwardly staring at each other. They finished dinner quickly and retreated to opposite ends of the sofa, the silence returning once more. We see Sam watching the television while Fiona, sitting nearby, checks her phone. Fiona leaned back on the sofa and sent a message to the neighborhood group chat. Not long after, the group administrator posted an official announcement. The lockdown was strictly due to 2 confirmed infection cases detected within the community. The expected duration for this quarantine was approximately 1 full month. And it turned out that Sam, trapped there by sheer bad luck, wasn't the only one. 2 or 3 other families also had visiting friends or relatives who were now locked in together. Although the authorities considered this situation an unfortunate accident, the rules were firm. They made it clear that, regardless of the circumstances during this sensitive period, no one was allowed to leave. Fiona read the announcement aloud from the sofa, absent-mindedly tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear as she processed the news. It seemed there was no way out. Sam would have to live with his teacher for a while. Upon hearing this, Sam turned his head to look at Fiona in disbelief. He asked if he really couldn't go back, but Fiona simply shook her head. She explained it wasn't possible, as the situation appeared to be quite serious this time. She decided that she would sleep on the sofa tonight, giving Sam the bedroom. As she offered to prepare the room, Sam waved his hands, feeling both surprised and flattered. He insisted it wasn't necessary and that he should be the one sleeping on the sofa. Since he was already imposing on her home, he couldn't possibly let her sleep in the living room. Besides, as we can see, that sofa was far too small for comfort anyway. Sam insisted that she wouldn't be able to sleep well there, but she was equally stubborn. He even offered to make a futon on the floor, noting that Fiona wasn't feeling her best. Sleeping on the sofa would hardly help her recovery. Fiona, who had been calm until then, suddenly opened her eyes wide and stared at him with an intensity that made him pause. She asked him quite pointedly exactly what he had just said. Sam froze, realizing in an instant that he had accidentally stepped into dangerous territory. He had definitely put his foot in it. He tried to backtrack, insisting he would just take the sofa. Fiona frowned, demanding to know how he could possibly have known she was unwell. He gave an awkward smile and glanced toward the table, searching for an explanation. He pointed to the hot brown sugar water she had just poured for herself to drink. He also mentioned noticing that she had been using warm water just to wash her hands. Upon hearing his reasoning, Fiona couldn't help but let out a soft, surprised giggle. She covered her mouth, looking at him with a mix of embarrassment and genuine curiosity. She admitted she never expected Sam to be such an incredibly observant young man. It seemed he was the type to notice even the smallest, most subtle details. Sam just smiled, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was meant as a compliment. Fiona felt flattered, but then she teased him, asking what else he might have noticed. As he thought about it, he recalled another detail from when he was in the bathroom. He noted that she had very few cosmetics and that there was no vanity table in her bedroom. He concluded that she must always go to school without any makeup at all. Fiona raised her eyebrows, realizing she had perhaps underestimated this young man's powers of observation. She noted that Sam certainly possessed a very sharp eye for detail. As it turned out, she truly didn't make a habit of wearing makeup. She only made an exception for important occasions, like today, for instance. Since it was graduation day, she felt she should dress up just a little bit. Without thinking, Sam replied that she looked quite beautiful even without any makeup at all. He added that it wasn't just his opinion. His classmates all agreed she was the prettiest teacher. Upon hearing this, Fiona's expression shifted into something rather unreadable. She remained silent for a long moment before finally choosing her words. She remarked that Sam must be quite popular with the girls at school. She asked if he'd had a girlfriend, but Sam insisted he hadn't, wondering why she'd ask. Fiona stood up and looked at him, suggesting that he wasn't being entirely sincere with her. A teacher's instincts, she claimed, were usually very accurate about these things. While she admitted his attention to detail was a good trait, she offered a small warning. There are some things, she noted, that are better left unexamined. After all, they were currently in her private home, a fact he shouldn't forget. Sam simply smiled and nodded, promising her that he wouldn't look too closely. Fiona said she was glad he understood as she began walking toward her bedroom. She explained that she needed to process some graduation documents for the class. She told him that if he felt tired, he was more than welcome to nap on the sofa. Regarding what we discussed just now, since Sam seemed so intent on taking care of his teacher, she decided that she would be sleeping in her bedroom tonight. Fiona picked up her glass of water from the coffee table, returned to her room, and closed the door. Sam stared at the closed door, took a deep, heavy breath, and ran a hand through his hair in frustration. He couldn't help but wonder what on earth he had just been thinking. Perhaps he had spent too much time drawing romance comics, and without realizing it, he was treating his teacher like the protagonist of one of his stories. As he spoke, he had accidentally dragged that scripted sweetness right into their actual conversation. It was a professional hazard, to be sure. Inside the bedroom, after closing the door, Fiona didn't sit down right away. Instead, she leaned against the door, set down her glass, and covered her face with her hands, muttering to herself about how utterly embarrassing the whole situation was. Being locked in together was bad enough, but now her student was noticing things he shouldn't. She felt completely flustered, wondering why these things always seemed to happen to her. As she recalled their conversation, Fiona frowned slightly and bit her lip, realizing that a boy this observant and attentive actually existed in the real world. She let out a sigh, thinking back on all the men who had tried to court her in the past. If any of them had been even half as considerate as Sam, or knew how to truly care for her, she would likely be married by now instead of being alone. Fiona stood there for a moment, letting her mind go blank to clear her thoughts. Finally, she went to her desk, turned on the computer, and pulled up the student files. She decided to get ahead on her work. Originally, she had planned to organize the graduation materials during her free time after returning to her hometown. But now, thanks to the lockdown, she could finish her summer break tasks well in advance. And so, following the school's assignments, Fiona set herself to work. She worked from noon until mid-afternoon, and after completing a third of the tasks, she leaned back lazily in her chair. She stared at the ceiling, let out a long sigh, and suddenly her mind drifted back to what had happened earlier that morning. In the comic she had been following, Eternal Graduation, the protagonists were just about to confess their feelings. It was a moment that made Fiona feel a certain sense of nostalgia. However, she also knew very well that love in comics is quite different from love in the real world. Unless you could actually date the author herself, it was practically impossible for anyone else to achieve the same level of detail as in the story. She wondered what kind of incredible author could write as if they had lived it in person. To be honest, Fiona hadn't liked these types of romance comics much in the past, mostly because so many love stories relied on very common, tired tropes. They often had too many senseless twists and obstacles, which she found quite annoying. But the story of Eternal Graduation was different from everything else on the market. The interactions between the male and female leads were so sweet they almost made her teeth ache. Their level of chemistry was at an all-time high, essentially pure sweetness from start to finish. Furthermore, the plot centered on the romance between a teacher and her student, which, as we can imagine, already generated a great deal of expectation and appeal. Fiona found herself lost in the plot of the comic, quietly murmuring to herself. The only problem was the updates were painfully slow, with barely a few pages a week. With this in mind, Fiona pulled out her phone and entered the official reader group. And there, in the exclusive group for paid subscribers, she began to type. She asked the others if they didn't think this week's update was a bit too short. It was only about 10 pages, and she wondered when the next update would arrive. Several readers replied immediately, noting that they too felt pages were missing. One even joked that they were so anxious they couldn't even eat. Fiona couldn't help but smile as she held her phone and watched the chat fly by. On the internet, she felt she didn't need to be nearly as formal as in real life. So she joined in, asking the author to please compensate them next week. She begged for more content, followed by a long, dramatic series of emoticons. Random messages from others flooded in, and they all tagged the group's moderator. The author finally replied, explaining she had some personal matters to attend to. Seeing the author speak, Fiona immediately asked if she would make up for the missing pages. She was desperate to know if the next update would be a double feature. Now, we return to our protagonist, the author herself, who was currently sitting on the sofa. She stared at the reader group on her phone, thinking that making up pages was impossible. After all, she was currently trapped inside her teacher's house. To be honest, work was the last thing on her mind. Her entire world had shrunk down to a single sofa, and she didn't even have her drawing tools with her. She wondered how she could possibly make up the pages, feeling truly sorry that she had run into such an unexpected problem. Next week seemed impossible. It looked like it might be a month or two before she could get back to work. Updating would be difficult. When Frank read this, his eyes widened and he began to type a reply. He asked why, and she explained there was no other way, as she had only gone to a friend's house to drop off some things. But then, the entire neighborhood was suddenly locked down, potentially for the next couple of months. So, for the foreseeable future, she told the group she probably wouldn't be able to update the comic at all. Frank, who until that moment had only been curious, felt a chill as he read the author's explanation. He froze when he realized she was trapped at a friend's house because the area had been sealed off. This situation felt strangely familiar to him. Frank quickly typed out another question. He asked if the author was really stuck with a friend, and she confirmed she was being forced to stay there. That was why she couldn't work, promising to make it up to everyone once the residential lockdown was finally lifted. To be honest, going 1 or 2 months without an update felt like an eternity to the fans. Someone asked what the author usually used to draw, and she explained she always used a tablet. Unfortunately, since she had only planned a quick visit to her friend's place, she hadn't brought it with her. The readers suggested using her friend's tablet, insisting that the update was far too important to miss. She sat on the sofa reading that suggestion and paused for a moment, completely stunned by the idea. Borrowing her teacher's tablet to draw her manga, well, it was a plan that just might work. It was a possibility, but she wasn't sure if she would be allowed, especially since she wasn't actually at a friend's house. She was at her professor's home, and since he used it for work, she doubted he would just hand it over. The group members began to wonder if Lily had even graduated yet, or if she was still just a student. She replied that she wasn't anymore, as she had actually graduated from the university that very day. Val, who at first had dismissed everything as a mere coincidence, couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. She decided to scroll back through the reader group's chat history to see what she might have missed. She covered her mouth in shock when she realized the author, Lily, was currently at her professor's house. She was locked in with him right after graduation. What a strange coincidence that was, wasn't it? But then Val reminded herself that it was, after all, graduation season for everyone. Given the current health crisis and the lockdowns, such a coincidence was almost understandable. Meanwhile, Lily, acting as her own little manager, sent another message to the group. She told them she was going to try and borrow the tablet right then and to wait for her news. At that exact moment, Val heard a sudden knock on her bedroom door. Lily was standing just outside the room, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and nerves. But this was for the update. If she stopped for 2 months, the readers would suffer, and so would she. After all, if she didn't provide any updates, she would quickly find herself completely out of money. She tentatively asked if the professor was busy, and Val looked up toward the door. She asked what was on Lily's mind, telling her she wasn't too busy and to just go ahead and speak. On the other side of the door, Lily swallowed hard and mentioned she remembered the professor had a tablet. She asked if it was used often, and if not, if she might be able to borrow it for a while. We see Val sitting there in her computer chair, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. As she heard the voice from outside the door, her eyes widened in a look of pure, utter disbelief. She stared intently at the wooden door, then lowered her head to look at the message just sent to the group. Once more, her gaze drifted back up toward the bedroom door. Deep down, she felt the situation was becoming far too surreal, because this little manager, Lily, well, it seemed the author wasn't just any woman. They shared the exact same graduation day, the same lockdown with a professor, and now, the same request to borrow a tablet. Could such a perfect coincidence truly exist in this world? It seemed highly unlikely. Outside, Leo heard no response from Val inside the bedroom. Assuming she was simply busy with her work, he gathered his courage and asked once more. He asked if it would be all right, adding that if she needed it for herself, it didn't matter. Val finally snapped back to reality and told Leo she could certainly lend it to him. But then, she couldn't help but ask what he actually needed the tablet for. Was it for games? Val stared at the door, her nerves beginning to fray, wondering if this little manager, Lily, was actually her student, Leo. If so, it would mean the manga author she had followed for over 6 months was actually her own student, and a young man at that, which, naturally, would be quite the revelation. Standing at the door, Leo quickly tried to improvise a believable excuse. He certainly couldn't tell Val that he wanted the tablet to draw a romance manga, especially not one written under a girl's name where the protagonist was based on Val herself. If his professor ever found out the truth, he told himself he would simply die of embarrassment. He stammered out that he was just bored and wanted to play some games to pass the time. Val heard his answer and felt a slight wave of disappointment, though on second thought, she suspected it was just an excuse. After all, who would reveal their secret identity? As a manga artist without a very good reason, and so she decided to press him further. Just games? Are you sure? Outside the door, Leo swallowed nervously, his heart racing. He suddenly realized that if he claimed he only wanted the tablet for gaming, his professor might not lend it to him at all. He needed a more justifiable reason. It's not just for games, he stammered. Actually, I want to borrow it, so I can practice my drawing. Inside the bedroom, Val sat frozen in her chair, listening to the frantic thumping of her own heart. This was getting interesting. Barring any major surprises, it was now almost certain that the little manager, Lily, that supposed female manga author, was actually her own student standing right there. Leo, she asked carefully, do you actually know how to draw? Do you draw manga? No, not manga. He lied quickly, just normal sketches. When I'm in the dorm, I usually draw landscapes. It's a decent hobby, isn't it? Oh, landscapes. She noted that she had no idea Leo had such a creative side. Well then, when you finish a piece, would you mind showing it to your professor? Sure, he replied, while Val let out a soft, thoughtful hum of agreement. Wait just a moment then, she told him. I'll bring the tablet out to you. Hearing those words, Leo finally let out a long breath of pure relief. He had managed to talk his way out of that corner. Thank you so much, Professor. Back in the bedroom, Val opened her desk drawer and took a moment to admire the painted landscape. She couldn't help but wonder, was Leo truly the mysterious manager, or was he not? Regardless, she decided to simply wait for him to finish his drawing and see how he handled it. That would be the ultimate test, since drawing comics is much like filming anime or movies. No two artists ever use the exact same framing techniques. It's like a creative fingerprint, really. But on the other hand, if this boy actually turned out to be that famous author, it would be quite impressive. She never imagined such hidden talent was lurking among her students. If she finally confirmed his identity, she intended to ask him seriously how he created this story. It was such a beautiful romance between a teacher and a student. Wait, a teacher and student? Val's hand, which was holding the tablet, suddenly froze mid-air as a thought struck her. In that moment, she realized she had always felt a strange sense of familiarity. The female lead in Eternal Graduation Diary shared her exact personality and character traits. If this cute little manager wasn't Leo, then that personality match might just be a coincidence. But if the great author and Leo were exactly the same person, then coincidence was off the table. At that point, the similarities would become far more intentional and far more personal. Now that she thought about it, the protagonist of Eternal Graduation Diary was quite familiar. In every word and every action, wasn't the character a perfect copy of herself? It was as if her real-world image had been captured and studied with incredible detail. Leo had essentially transported her into his two-dimensional world. And if that were true, then not only the heroine, but the male protagonist of the comic seemed to have a certain charm. The character bore a striking resemblance to Leo himself. In fact, they were almost identical. At most, the comic's protagonist looked a bit more tired than the real Leo usually did, but their way of speaking and their mannerisms were exactly the same. Val stood there in total disbelief. She covered her mouth with one hand, her eyes trembling as she looked at the tablet inside the drawer. If her guess was right and Leo really was the author, then he had drawn a story where, in a two-dimensional world, the two of them fell in love. Meanwhile, we see Leo standing at the door, having waited quite a while for Val to open it. For no apparent reason, his hands were beginning to sweat. To be honest, he was feeling the pressure. His heart was racing, and deep down, he had a very bad feeling about this. He had no idea how long he had been standing there in the hallway. Finally, Val slowly opened the door to let him in. Instinctively, he addressed her as his teacher. She looked back at him with those sharp, fox-like eyes. Her face, at least on the surface, appeared to be perfectly calm and composed. She held out the tablet, which even came with a stylus to make the drawing process easier. She told him to take it and reminded him to show her the results once he was finished. Leo looked directly into Val's eyes and gave a silent, obedient nod. He thanked her politely and took the device from her hands. As he turned toward the sofa, he felt a small, secret sense of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected things to go this smoothly, which, naturally, was his first mistake. Just as he was carrying the tablet over to sit down, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, Val added a question, asking if he planned to use the tablet frequently. Leo turned back toward her and offered a small, polite smile. He murmured an affirmative, thinking that since he had nothing else to do, he might draw something to kill time, though he offered to return it if she needed it. Val quickly interrupted his explanation with a gentle smile of her own. She explained that she rarely used the tablet, as she had a laptop in her room. She told him he was free to take it and use it whenever he liked. Leo nodded in appreciation and thanked his tutor once again. Val gave him one last look and prepared to close the bedroom door. But just before the door clicked shut, she spoke up one more time. She mentioned she was busy with work and would start cooking around 6 o'clock. She asked if he was hungry yet, and Leo simply shook his head. He had eaten quite a bit at noon, so Val smiled and finally closed the door. As the door shut softly, Val leaned her back against the frame, lowered her head, and pulled out her phone to message the Eternal Graduation Diary reader group. The messages came in fast, asking the great manager if she had secured the tablet. Others joined in immediately, eager to know if her little mission had been a success. They wondered why she was silent, fearing perhaps the teacher hadn't lent it to her after all. Val stared intently at the screen, nervously awaiting a response from the author herself. And sure enough, a few seconds later, the author of the group finally spoke. She typed back that she had secured it, adding that her tutor had mentioned something interesting. Apparently, he rarely uses the tablet, so she might be able to update her work normally from now on. Val, with her beautiful eyes fixed intently on that single line of text, watched the messages flood the group chat and once again covered her mouth in stunned silence. At this point, it seemed almost unnecessary to see Leo's drawings, because in this world, it is simply impossible for so many coincidences to repeat themselves in such a short time. But she reminded herself that she was his tutor, his former college advisor and teacher, and 5 or 6 years older than him. Could he really be interested in a woman like her? Perhaps he had simply taken her personality as a bit of inspiration for his story. Yet, even if it was just inspiration, he must have had the initial impulse and the idea. She couldn't quite imagine it. Val set her phone down on the nearby table, and her mind involuntarily drifted back to Leo and the words he had once said to her. He had told her she looked good even without makeup, and that he wasn't the only one who thought so. His classmates said it too, that their tutor was the most beautiful among all the teachers. Wasn't she feeling unwell? He had insisted she shouldn't have to sleep on the sofa, claiming that as long as she didn't have to sleep there, everything would be fine. No wonder he said that. He clearly noticed those small details that everyone else seemed to overlook. So, that was the truth of it. Val slowly crouched down right where she stood. She covered her face with her hands, her cheeks inexplicably burning with a sudden heat. Despite her mature appearance, in that moment, for some reason, she looked quite adorable. How embarrassing. Was there anything more mortifying in the entire world? She whispered to herself that after everything she had experienced today, she barely knew where she was. Given the circumstances, how was she supposed to be alone with this boy for the next few months? We returned to the living room, where Leo held the borrowed tablet and glanced toward the bedroom door. He had just logged into the creator dashboard and was briefly reviewing the latest data for his manga. If things continued at this rate, he calculated he could earn about $100,000 by the end. With that kind of money, he planned to buy a truly wonderful gift for his tutor. He knew this book was a success, and that Val, as the real-world inspiration for the protagonist, had been absolutely fundamental. To be honest, if Val hadn't been his tutor from the start, he never would have been able to draw such a successful manga in the first place. And now that he was living in her home, giving her a gift was only the beginning. He planned to talk to her at dinner about splitting the costs for groceries, water, and electricity over the next 2 months. It was only fair, after all. He wasn't so poor that he actually needed to live off her charity for free. Continuing to stay at Val's expense for months would be unethical and, frankly, quite off-putting. He gripped the stylus and opened 2 drawing panels on the tablet screen. Following the current plot of Eternal Graduation, he first continued drawing the subsequent developments. After finishing about half an arc, he began sketching landscapes on the second panel. Meanwhile, we see that Val wasn't exactly staying idle in the bedroom either. Barefoot, she sat at the head of the bed with her legs tucked comfortably beneath her. As if driven by a sudden impulse, she picked up her phone and began reading from the very beginning. The romantic manga, Eternal Graduation. By now, Val had already guessed that she was the inspiration for the story's female lead, and the male lead was her student, Leo. Because of this, her perspective as she reread the plot was almost completely different from the first time she had seen it. Her entire understanding of the work had undergone a qualitative shift. At the start of the story, we see that the 2 protagonists had very little contact. In school, they felt a simple mutual sympathy, but it remained strictly at the level of a friendship. They never crossed any boundaries. At the time, Val had read the plot without much concern. She hadn't found anything special until, during an organized school trip in the manga, the male lead spotted the female protagonist alone late at night. She was sitting under a large tree, staring distractedly at the moon with a melancholy expression. That sight completely captivated him, and their romantic storyline officially began right then and there. According to the plot, the reason she couldn't sleep and sat under that tree was because her younger sister was suffering from a serious illness, which explained her distress. She looked so dull and sad, a far cry from her usual self, which, naturally, was quite heartbreaking. Seeing her like that, the protagonist didn't hesitate to sit by her side to offer comfort. He told her she seemed a bit sad. His words of consolation were very simple, and yet they conveyed an affection that almost overflowed from the screen. It was all in the small details of daily life, until, after a long conversation between the 2, the male lead also gazed up at the moon, just as she was doing. And finally, he spoke, confessing that for some reason, whenever he saw her sad, his own heart ached as well. At that moment, the plot reached its climax. The female lead in the manga was left completely stunned by his words. After a brief moment of daze, caught between shyness and anger, she called him a little rascal. She asked what he was even saying, insisting she wasn't a child in need of comfort. She reminded him she was his teacher, but he only smiled and replied that he knew, adding that he was simply telling the truth and she shouldn't take it so seriously. That particular chapter of the manga was aptly titled Heartbeat. When Val had read it for the first time, it had been late at night. Back then, that simple and charming conversation between the 2 characters had truly touched her heart. But now, as she reread it, the feeling was entirely different. Watching this scene again, Val still felt her whole body tense up, only this time. Instead of lying down, she was sitting upright on her bed. She hugged her legs tightly as the fluttering sensation in her chest began to fade, giving way to an indescribable sense of strangeness and confusion. Val stared at the manga panels, biting her lip with focused intensity. She realized that Leo had truly been the one to draw all of this. The plot felt so real. She wondered if he had felt that way whenever he saw her sad at school. Val tried to recall every moment of her interactions with Leo back at the academy. This shift in perspective brought about a complete change in all of her past memories. Conversations that once seemed perfectly normal now felt entirely different when viewed through this new lens. Realizing that the young man might actually have feelings for her, Val closed her eyes in resignation. She set her phone aside, leaned her head against the headboard, and let out a long, deep sigh. By 6 in the evening, Val still hadn't emerged from her bedroom. It was unclear what she was doing. Leo waited until about 6:30, when suddenly, a series of loud, heavy knocks echoed at the front door. A voice announced they were there for the mandatory health tests and asked them to open up. The sudden noise startled Leo, snapping him out of the deep trance of his drawing. He stood up, walked over to the bedroom door, and gave it a light tap. He told her the testers had arrived. Val, who was still inside browsing through a comic, heard the knocking. She felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of panic and quickly replied that she understood. She promised to be right out. Meanwhile, Leo went to answer the front door. The officials explained they were there to conduct the routine nucleic acid tests. They asked for their cooperation, noting the process was simple, just a quick swab of the throat. It would only be a slight graze and wouldn't take much time at all. When Val finally stepped out of the bedroom, she deliberately adjusted her composure, so that, at least in Leo's eyes, his tutor still appeared to be her usual self. She had that same slender figure and those striking, beautiful eyes, and whenever she moved, she still carried that signature, delicate scent of her favorite perfume. However, things felt stranger than usual today. As she took the test, she looked at him with an odd expression. It was a look he had never seen before. She seemed angry, yet it wasn't exactly a look of anger. Once the test was over and the officials left, Val immediately asked Leo about his work. She wondered if she might be allowed to see the landscape he had been painting. He agreed, of course, and Val followed him over to the sofa. He picked up the tablet and showed her the nearly finished drawing of the school's sports field. As he handed it over, he modestly told her not to laugh, claiming he wasn't very good. Val watched him for a moment, wondering how she could possibly laugh at such effort. In her eyes, his drawing skills were actually quite impressive. She felt his technique was strong, even if it leaned toward the style of a serialized comic book. But the moment she took the tablet, her eyes widened in genuine surprise. He had indeed captured the school field, but it wasn't just a simple landscape. The scene was alive with the silhouettes of dozens of students. We see a small bird perched on a basketball hoop and a kitten hiding in a corner. And there she was, wearing her sun hat. Furthermore, there was something else. Val couldn't tell if it was just her imagination, but she felt a certain shift in the work. It seemed that among all the characters, he had drawn her with the most exquisite detail. Countless tiny features became clearly visible the moment she zoomed in on the image. He had included the small mole on her collarbone and the bracelet she almost never wore. Even the intricate details of a necklace she used to wear had been perfectly captured. Val held the tablet firmly, then lifted her gaze to look directly at Leo. He felt a wave of nerves wash over him before she finally asked if it had taken more than an hour. Leo nodded, confirming it had. Val stared intently at the screen and began to murmur to herself. She wondered aloud if he had been learning to draw since he was a small child. He admitted he was entirely self-taught, modestly claiming he wasn't actually very good at it. Val couldn't help but smile at that, questioning how he could possibly think it wasn't good. To her, it was truly impressive, and she hadn't expected him to possess such a hidden talent. She pointed out that while he hadn't drawn himself yet, he had already finished her. His own figure was just a simple curve, yet she was already fully colored in. He replied without thinking, explaining he planned to color his tutor first before drawing himself. Val looked up, silently asking for a reason, which left Leo completely at a loss for words. He didn't really know why, but that afternoon, after sketching her into the image, he simply felt the urge to finish her colors before even starting on his own character. He couldn't even explain his own thoughts or why he had made that specific choice. Val pursed her lips, giving him a look that suggested she knew exactly what was going on. Without pressing him further, she turned her attention back to the digital image. From the technical details, it was easy to see the style of the artist she had always admired, the one known online as the reasonable little manager. And Leo was undoubtedly the creator behind the series, never graduating, always creating. There was no mistake. Val handed the tablet back and told him to keep drawing. She told him to show it to her once he was finished. As she headed off to cook, Leo took the tablet and looked toward Val with a focused gaze. He asked if she wanted to see it when it was done, noting that he was happy to share his work. Our tutor certainly wanted to see how the final piece would look once it was completely finished. Besides, since they were going to be stuck inside together for a while, she had a small request. She asked if he might be willing to draw a portrait of her as well. Leo agreed immediately, claiming it was what he did best, which was true enough. He joked he could do it with his eyes closed, causing Val to smile and nod in approval. She thanked him warmly before mentioning again that she was going to start on dinner. As Val went into the kitchen and closed the door, she saw him leaning over the table once more. Leo began to draw in earnest, and as he did, Val's expression grew surprisingly serious. Deep down, she was starting to feel a strange, lingering sensation about the whole situation. She couldn't stop thinking about his hesitation when she asked why he had colored her character first. Val was trying to confirm a theory of her own, whether Leo actually had feelings for her or not. She couldn't be entirely certain, but she was sure the boy had been stealing glances at her. After all, how else would he have known about the tiny mole on her collarbone? He had even captured the specific accessories she wore, details that a typical student usually ignores. How could he possibly have remembered those things with such perfect clarity? Returning to the present, Val watched him while he remained completely lost in his work. Setting aside the fact that he was her student, she had to admit that Leo was quite handsome. He seemed to stand at least 6 feet tall, easily towering half a head over her own 5'7" stature. He also possessed a pleasant face, and his overall manner and way of speaking weren't bad at all. He was a big, sweet, and handsome guy, not to mention a manga artist with seemingly infinite potential, especially considering how incredibly attentive he was toward her. To be honest, he was a significant improvement over the men who had tried to court her in the past. In fact, if it weren't for the simple detail that he was a student she had once taught, the only real difference between them would be their age. She caught herself wondering why she was even considering whether Leo's qualities made him a good partner. He was just a boy, after all. She told herself she was likely just imagining things that weren't there. We see Leo glance at her again while he draws, just as Val opens the refrigerator door. She skillfully took out some tomatoes and eggs and began the familiar routine of chopping vegetables and cooking. But this time, as she worked, Val intentionally took out her phone and placed it right next to the cutting board, with the screen displaying her readers' group chat. While she cooked, Val kept a close eye on the chat, watching Leo interact there in real time. Every time the author, known as the Little Golden Carp, posted a new message, Leo would turn to look at her, confirming that she was indeed on the sofa, sending messages from her phone. It was, to put it mildly, a truly strange sensation for her. The idol he had always admired through a screen turned out to be his very own teacher. In the past, Leo had often tried to imagine what this mysterious manga artist would actually be like. He had pictured a male author who might be radiant and handsome, which tells you everything about his expectations. He had imagined someone melancholy and attentive, or perhaps a female author who was elegant, calm, and sweet as water. In short, whoever could create such stories was impressive, no matter how much he tried to picture them. At times, Leo had even thought he would love to find a manga artist to be his partner, but as much as he pondered it, the reality of the situation was something he never could have predicted. It never occurred to him that his favorite artist would be right here, looking like this. Though, to be fair, the part about being radiant and handsome certainly turned out to be true. However, there was the issue of her being quite young, not to mention the complicated matter of her true identity. Back in the kitchen, Val poured a bit of oil into the stainless steel pot. She began adding the chopped tomatoes, one handful at a time. The extractor fan hummed steadily in the background, pulling away the thin wisps of dark smoke. Val stayed focused, watching the eggs as she tossed them in the pan, fully absorbed in her cooking. Now that she knew his secret, she couldn't help but steal a few more glances at the talented artist in her living room. What she didn't realize, of course, was that Leo was watching her just as often as she was watching him. He held his brush in one hand and his phone in the other, but his eyes kept drifting away from his work. Without even meaning to, he found himself staring at Val while she continued to sauté the vegetables. From his perspective, her eyes framed by long lashes looked particularly enchanting in profile. As a manga artist, he was naturally inclined to pay close attention to beautiful things. He made a habit of storing such images in his memory, ready to draw them whenever the inspiration struck. And in that small, quiet apartment, he wondered what could possibly be more beautiful than the scene before him. Without a doubt, he found himself lost in thought, simply watching her for a long while. Suddenly, Leo's eyes drifted slightly and landed right on her. In that very moment, their gazes met entirely by chance. Those silent looks pierced through the glass door, catching the soft glow of the light. They were observing one another, and after a long moment of that strange eye contact, she quickly looked away and went back to her drawing, pretending it was just an accidental glance. Leo did the same, acting as if it were a casual encounter before withdrawing his gaze. He returned his focus to the hot sauté in the stainless steel pot, but he pursed his lips in thought. Was she actually looking at him, or was it truly just a coincidence that their eyes met? Now that he knew the truth, Leo felt that every single one of her movements seemed a bit unusual. It's like when you work at a company and a colleague of the opposite sex rarely speaks to you. You might assume they dislike you, but then other coworkers tell you they actually like you, and that they simply get too nervous to strike up a conversation. Once you know the truth, even if that person remains silent the next day, you start to feel that their attitude isn't one of rejection at all, and suddenly, their shyness even seems a little bit adorable. In short, a simple change in perspective can change everything. After finishing the meal, Leo called out for Val to wash her hands and come to the kitchen. She gave a quick hum of agreement, and hearing his call, she set down her stylus and hurried to the bathroom to wash up. During dinner, just as he had done that morning, Leo handed her the chopsticks. Leo looked down at the scrambled eggs and tomatoes sitting on the table. He blinked, took a bite with his chopsticks, and slowly began to eat. It tasted just like it had that morning. Val ate her rice slowly, chewing each bite with care. During the meal, a long silence stretched out between them. It wasn't until they were halfway through their dinner that Val finally spoke up. She asked him if, now that he had graduated, he had called home yet. Leo looked at her and explained that he hadn't, since his parents worked during the day. They rarely answered his calls, so he usually waited until night if he had something to say. Val noted that with the current situation, returning home wouldn't be possible for a while. She insisted that he definitely needed to call them and let them know what was happening. She then wondered aloud if he could even get a ticket if he wanted to go home. The situation had become quite grave. Leo shook his head, admitting he wasn't sure. Talking about it seemed easy enough, but the reality was far more complicated. His mother thought nothing would happen. Who could have guessed that today, of all days, he would be delivering these documents? If they ended up sealing off the entire area, he doubted he would be able to go home at all. He mentioned that when he arrived at noon, he saw the counselor packing her bags. He asked Val if she had been planning on heading home today as well. Val took a bite of vegetables with her chopsticks and chewed thoughtfully. With a resigned sigh, she admitted she wanted to visit, as it had been 6 months since her last trip. No one expected things to turn out like this. She then asked Leo what his family did for a living. Leo explained that his father worked in the wholesale business. His mother, however, had injured her arm in an accident and was currently resting at home. Val noted that, as a recent graduate, Leo was clearly destined to be the pillar of his family. She asked if he felt the pressure of graduation yet, and he admitted it was a bit of both. For now, the weight wasn't too heavy, but he suspected it would grow as time went on. He joked that the real pressure would start the moment he found a girlfriend. After all, staying in a city like this meant he would eventually need to buy a car and a house. He knew he'd have to earn everything himself, which led Val to suggest he needed a partner to help manage things. She pictured a more mature girlfriend for him, someone who could support him in both his life and his career. Because, as we all know, life is much more comfortable when two people strive together. Leo agreed, though he noted that finding that kind of partner was easier said than done. To be honest, none of the girls he knew seemed to fit that particular description. It was a casual comment from one and an equally casual response from the other. But after that exchange, they looked at each other and a sudden silence fell over the table. We see Val's expression shift as her chewing became noticeably more deliberate. The pace of the meal slowed down, and the atmosphere grew unexpectedly awkward for no clear reason. Leo wondered how their easy conversation had suddenly hit such a strange dead end. He feigned indifference, lowering his head to focus on his food once again. Val followed suit, picking at her vegetables and chewing slowly as she lost herself in thought. After a moment of quiet reflection, she looked up and asked him another question. She asked if he had anyone in mind, or perhaps a specific girl he was planning to win over. Even while eating, Val couldn't help but offer her own perspective on his romantic prospects. Suddenly, the female lead from his own comic flashed through Leo's mind, and he decided to tell the truth. He admitted he hadn't found anyone yet, causing Val's expression to shift as she addressed him formally. She seemed genuinely surprised, asking if he really hadn't had a single girlfriend in all 4 years of college. Leo offered an embarrassed smile, wondering how on earth he was supposed to have found time for love. His time had been entirely consumed by his comic, a project he loved and hated in equal measure. Val pressed further, asking if he'd had any luck before college, but the answer remained the same. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. Having his own advisor ask such personal questions was unexpected. To be perfectly honest, he wanted nothing more than to disappear from the world right then and there. Val's expression turned quite strange, as if she were processing a very rare piece of information. An inexplicable smile spread across her face, as if she found the whole situation truly incredible. She noted that in their school, good men like Leo were few and far between, a rare breed indeed. She teased him, asking if he intended to save all his firsts for his future girlfriend. The words sounded odd to his ears. They didn't exactly feel like a compliment, but something else entirely. Realizing he couldn't let this topic continue, he quickly turned the tables and asked about her own life. He pointed out that in all the years he'd known her, he had never once heard of her having a boyfriend. Val froze instantly, blinking in surprise, which caused Leo to let out a small gasp of realization. Without thinking, he blurted out the question, had she never had a boyfriend either? They stared at each other in a heavy silence, realizing they might be in the exact same boat. Suddenly, Leo began to cough and let out a nervous laugh, trying to soften the awkward tension hanging in the air. He remarked that it seemed Val's standards must be incredibly high, given her current situation. He added that even if she hadn't had a boyfriend, someone as beautiful as her surely had plenty of suitors. Val quickly shifted her gaze away from his face, focusing intently on her chopsticks instead. She admitted that there certainly hadn't been a shortage of men trying to win her over throughout the years. However, she explained that she simply hadn't met anyone she truly liked, which is why she remained alone. Leo offered a kind word, expressing his certainty that she would eventually find her destined person. Val looked at him fixedly for a moment before a small, genuine smile played on her lips. She teased him, noting that he had a rather literary and poetic way of speaking for a former student. But she thanked him nonetheless, admitting that she chose to believe in that destiny as well. We see Leo suddenly remember something important, asking if she had checked the neighborhood group chat that afternoon. He was curious if anyone had mentioned how long this lockdown was actually expected to last. Val shook her head, noting that the topic hadn't really come up again in the group messages. It seemed the confinement would last at least a month, leading Leo to bring up a practical matter. He suggested that they should find a way to split the costs for water, electricity, and food. He was well aware that living there for so long would end up costing her a significant amount of money. He insisted he couldn't keep living off her resources, but she waved it off, reminding him he was her student. She argued that a little food and water hardly cost anything, and there was no need to divide the bills. Leo stood his ground, reminding her that while she looked after everyone at school, things were different now. Now that he had graduated, he felt he couldn't keep taking advantage of her kindness without feeling guilty. Val saw that Leo was being completely serious, and knowing he was a manga artist, she assumed he wasn't short on cash. Still, there is a world of difference between having money and wanting to share. The expenses, many people, even with full pockets, wouldn't have such a conscience. This young man, it seemed, was quite responsible. Val smiled and nodded, and once they had finished their dinner, Leo stepped up and offered to wash the dishes. Val politely declined at first, but he insisted, knowing she hadn't been feeling well that day. He had already washed them at noon, but letting her do it again at night simply didn't feel fair. Val couldn't win the argument, and in the end, she had to agree to divide the labor. The plan was simple. The student would wash the dishes while the teacher cleaned the table. Leo accepted without a second thought. So, at around 7 in the evening, Val was busy wiping down the table, occasionally turning her head to catch a glimpse of Leo at the sink. Perhaps it was just a coincidence, but when they both turned at the same time, their eyes met once again. This time, however, neither of them looked away instantly. Instead, they shared a quiet smile before returning to their tasks. After the chores were done, Val went to her room. to find a light summer blanket. In this heat, Leo was going to be sleeping on the living room sofa. And since the main air conditioning would be running, he couldn't sleep uncovered without catching a cold. She reminded him to make sure he used the blanket when he finally went to bed, warning him that the air could get quite chilly. Leo smiled and took it, thanking his former tutor. Val smiled back and told him she was heading to her room to continue her work. Leo, for his part, remained occupied with his own thoughts. It was his very first time spending the night at a woman's house, and he didn't want to overstep. After settling in, Leo decided to send a quick message to check in with his contacts. He set his things aside and let himself fall onto the sofa, where he'd be sleeping tonight. It was, to be honest, the very first time he had ever stayed over at a woman's house. He exhaled a long sigh, planning to work on his manga, when suddenly his phone buzzed. It was a barrage of messages from his friend, Mike. "Hey handsome, how's it going over there?" The messages kept coming. "When are you back? If I don't write, you never do, right?" Leo opened the chat with Mike, who was apparently still buried under a mountain of work. It seemed his friend was still struggling with those endless presentation slides and assignments. The conversation devolved into a chaotic string of complaints about the sheer volume of tasks. Mike went on a long, rambling vent about his family, his projects, and his mounting stress. He seemed to be reaching his breaking point with the workload in his current location. He complained about the people around him and the constant pressure he was under lately. He felt like he was being stabbed in the back by all the work he had to finish so quickly. Mike lamented his luck, claiming he was too much of a coward for such a high-stakes project. Leo realized there wasn't much he could do to help, so he simply wished his friend luck. But Mike wasn't done. "What about work? I'm forced to be here, you know." Leo reminded him that if he hadn't forgotten his graduation materials, he wouldn't be in this mess. Besides, Leo wasn't exactly having a relaxing time living with his former tutor. It felt quite awkward. On the other end of the line, Mike suddenly burst out laughing. "You're with that fierce woman?" He bid Leo good luck, joking that he hoped his friend would still be alive when they next met. When Mike said those words, both Leo and Sophie, who had just stepped out of her room, froze. We see the silence stretch between them as Sophie's previously kind expression suddenly shifted. Her face darkened with irritation as she asked who exactly was on the phone with him. She realized it was Mike from their class and demanded the phone, walking straight toward Leo. Leo swallowed hard and whispered to Mike, who was still rambling, to stop talking nonsense. He tried to warn him that the tutor was right there, but Mike didn't hear him at all. Mike kept going, telling Leo not to fear because he'd be there to comfort him if that beast mistreated him. Sophie reached Leo's side in an instant, her face a mask of grim determination as she held out her hand. Leo obediently handed over the phone, knowing better than to resist in a moment like this. She took it, her lips pressed thin, and asked the voice on the other end if it was indeed Mike. The moment Sophie's voice rang out, the chatter on the other side of the line went dead silent. Sophie glanced at Leo before asking Mike if he had suddenly decided he didn't want his degree anymore. She asked if he thought graduating today gave him the right to talk such nonsense, demanding to know why he was mute. Leo bit his lip and turned his head away, finding the whole scene, to be honest, a little bit funny. From the other end of the phone, a panicked voice finally squeaked out an apology. Mike claimed he had dialed the wrong number and hung up immediately, leaving Leo to face the music. Leo stood up and apologized, explaining that Mike was always talking nonsense and didn't mean anything by it. He tried to play it off, suggesting she ignore it, though deep down he knew she wouldn't forget easily. Normally, Sophie would have had plenty to say, but this time she simply noted it wasn't the right moment. She merely told him that it wasn't the time for him to be lingering near the bathroom. And so, the evening continued in a quiet, somewhat awkward fashion. A little later, after the tension had settled, Leo returned to his room. Meanwhile, he sat on the sofa, watching the bathroom light, wondering why Sophie hadn't lectured him today. In any normal situation, she surely would have scolded him. He wondered if her good mood meant she was simply letting it go, or if she truly wasn't feeling well. That night, they didn't speak again as Sophie went to her room early and turned off the light. Leo stayed busy with his comic until past 1 in the morning, finally turning in for the night. The following morning, we see that Sophie looked pale, as if she were in discomfort. Still, she got up early to boil some eggs for breakfast, placing 3 eggs and a glass of warm milk in front of him. Having stayed up late, Leo washed his face and sat down, noticing her tired expression. Seeing how pale she was, he asked if she was all right, but she only managed a strained smile. She told him she wasn't hungry and suggested he eat while she went to lie down for a while. As she turned away, he noticed her clutching her stomach. Now, Leo had never had a girlfriend, but drawing romance comics had given him a certain amount of knowledge regarding female physiology. Sophie's reaction seemed like menstrual pain, and quite severe at that. Looking at the warm milk and the eggs, he felt a bit indebted to her. After finishing the milk, he went to the kitchen to look for some brown sugar, certain she would have some. Sure enough, he found both brown sugar and ginger in the fridge, though the shells were mostly empty, containing only tomatoes, eggs, and milk. Recalling the meals from previous days, he couldn't help but swallow hard at the thought. He wondered if Sophie loved tomato and eggs that much, or if it was simply the only thing she knew how to cook. Taking out the brown sugar and ginger, he began to prepare some brown sugar water. The method, as we see, is quite simple. He had seen it on the internet. Slice the ginger, add water, and let it boil for 10 minutes. After a quick taste test, he found it quite good. He poured a cup and walked to Sophie's bedroom door. He knocked gently and called out to her. Inside, she was curled up in bed, looking quite miserable. Hearing the knock, she asked weakly what was wrong, wondering if something had happened to Leo. Trying to be as gentle as possible, he told her he had noticed she wasn't looking well a moment ago. He asked if she was feeling all right and mentioned he'd prepared some brown sugar water for her to drink. She seemed a bit surprised by the gesture. After a brief moment of silence, she finally spoke. She told him to come in, noting that the door shouldn't be locked. He pushed it open and entered. The room smelled faintly of the drink, but she looked even paler now, clutching her stomach in clear distress. As she reached out, her hand trembled with pain. He asked if it hurt that much, his concern growing. He asked if she had any painkillers in the house, but she shook her head, explaining she hadn't bought any lately. He then asked about a hot water bottle, and she gestured toward the nightstand by the bed. He told her to drink the sugar water first while he went to prepare the hot water bottle for her. She nodded, but the pain was so intense that she couldn't even manage to reach out her hand. He offered to help her drink it. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and thanked him quietly. He told her it was no trouble at all, the very least he could do, and sat down beside her. Carefully holding the cup, he blew on it to cool it down, advising her to drink slowly as it was still hot. She took a small, cautious sip. He watched her closely, asking if it was still too hot for her. She nodded weakly. He blew on the liquid once more, and she managed to drink half of it. When she finished, she whispered her thanks. He told her to wait just a moment. As he set the glass down and went to find the hot water bottle. Opening the nightstand drawer, he reached for the hot water bottle he expected to find. But he couldn't help but notice some black lace underwear tucked inside as well. He froze for a second, a bit awkward, to be honest, before quickly closing the drawer with the bottle in hand. He realized then that it was rechargeable. He smiled, noting that this electric version didn't even need water. Sophie smiled sheepishly, admitting she hadn't known. She had only used the old-fashioned kind back in her hometown. He asked with a light laugh if she really thought he'd have to fill it with boiling water. Sophie frowned slightly, realizing she probably wouldn't have had the strength to open an old one anyway. He suggested taking it to charge, noting that it should be ready quite soon. He nodded and told his tutor to wait just a little longer while he went to the living room to plug the bottle in. It would likely take about 10 minutes to heat up. We see him return to the bedroom shortly after. The bottle was charging, he told her. He asked how she was feeling, noticing that her complexion had already improved significantly. She admitted the pain wasn't as sharp anymore and thanked Leo once again. He told her it was no trouble and suggested preparing some hot water for her to soak her feet. Since the bottle would take a while, he thought it might help, but she politely declined. She insisted it wasn't necessary and told him he should get back to his own things. He simply smiled, promising it would be quick. He glanced at the remaining sugar water in her glass. He sat down and told her to drink it all, promising to prepare a bit more afterward. He hadn't realized that she was already strong enough to reach out her hand. Even so, he gently blew on the liquid and held it to her lips himself. She drank slowly until the glass was empty, savoring the warmth. He took the glass and went to prepare more sugar water before putting a kettle on to boil. A few minutes later, we see him return carrying a basin filled with steaming hot water. Her complexion had improved significantly, and he asked if the pain had finally subsided. She placed the hot water bottle back and carefully readjusted the warm glass against her abdomen. She shook her head gently, assuring Leo that she was feeling much better now. When he asked if she had breakfast, she seemed momentarily stunned by the question. She admitted she'd had some milk, but hadn't managed to eat her egg yet. He spoke softly, explaining that he had only been worried because he saw how much she was suffering. He urged her to eat the egg quickly before it grew cold. She agreed, deciding it was probably best to try and eat something after all. He stood up to leave, telling her to call out if she needed anything else. His gaze briefly caught sight of her small, pale feet, which seemed to emphasize her delicate frame. It was only then that he noticed her white shirt was slightly unbuttoned at the collar. The side of her neck and her long legs beneath her shorts made the room feel a bit smaller. He stepped out, and shortly after, Sophie emerged carrying the basin to empty it. Her footsteps were incredibly light. He turned to watch her for a moment, but said nothing. Sophie was in the bathroom, and we see her standing before the mirror, carefully applying something to her face. Her lips soon took on a soft, hydrated glow, looking bright and healthy once more. After that, she rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a brand new toothbrush and a fresh towel. She approached him and handed them over, calling him partner Leo as she offered the supplies. She told him they were new, though she admitted she didn't have any toothbrushes specifically for men. She suggested he just make do with them, noting that she had placed everything on the bathroom shelf. Leo looked up and offered a small smile, thanking his tutor for the kind gesture. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed her lips and wondered if she had just applied lip balm. They looked much better than before, and after setting the items down, she moved toward the window. She stepped out onto the balcony to check the situation around the apartment complex. When she returned, she called out to him again, addressing him as partner Leo. She asked if he was still working on his landscape drawing, to which he gave a simple hum of affirmation. He told her he had just finished it and invited her over to take a look at the result. She walked over and sat down beside him, and he handed her the tablet to inspect his work. She looked at the screen and smiled, telling him that he was truly incredible. She remarked that if she had known sooner that Leo had such a remarkable talent for drawing, back when they had class activities that required painting or artistic skill, she would have called on him for everything. He just smiled and said he only drew for fun. He admitted he'd rather not be the center of attention, but she joked that being too modest is just another form of arrogance. She then stared intently at the drawing, asking him to send her a copy once he saved it. She told him she wanted to keep it and asked if that was all right, promising to send it over later. As she focused on the drawing, Leo found himself simply watching her instead. He noticed she always carried a faint, pleasant scent, not quite perfume, but something more natural. When she let a quiet yawn, he asked if she had managed to get any sleep at all the night before. She looked exhausted, though she gave a small shake of her head in response. She admitted that she hadn't just slept poorly, she had barely slept a wink. She had spent the entire night feeling unwell, though she reassured him she was much better now. She thanked him, calling him partner Leo, and noting how well he had looked after his teacher today. She suggested that if he wanted, he could go to the bedroom now to catch up on some sleep. To be honest, he probably needed it, but he just smiled and said it wasn't necessary. He preferred to sleep after eating, so she suggested they watch some television together for a while. She told him to take a break, and he quietly agreed to the idea. She looked at him and remarked on his height, noting it wasn't good for him to be hunched over a tablet. She insisted that from now on, he should use her study desk whenever he wanted to draw. He told her she shouldn't go to any trouble, but she insisted it was no trouble at all. She explained that she was finishing up some university admissions work over the next few days. And after that, she wouldn't be using the desk much anyway, so he should use it freely. Then, she turned the conversation back to the TV, asking what kind of programs he usually enjoyed. He answered without thinking, admitting that he rarely watched much of anything at all. He told her to put on whatever she liked, which made her wonder why he watched so little television. She asked him again, calling him partner Leo, what exactly he usually liked to watch. He felt a bit nervous, but he finally admitted that he mostly watched anime or movies. She told him that from now on, there was absolutely no reason for him to hide his interests. She laughed, noting that modern anime is actually very well made these days. She even confessed that she watches a few series herself from time to time. This took him by surprise. He had never imagined his teacher would be into anime. She explained that while she watches some, she mostly sticks to romantic films, like the famous ones from a few years ago. She listed titles like Your Name, The Garden of Words, and 5 centimeters per second. It turned out she had seen every single one of them. Hearing those familiar names made him quite excited, as they were all masterpieces by Makoto Shinkai. He told her he never would have guessed she enjoyed those kinds of films. Sophie gave a resigned smile and asked if it really was that shocking to him. She pointed out that, as a teacher, she isn't actually that different from her student. Sophie smiled and reminded him that being an adult doesn't mean life is only about work. Everyone needs entertainment. Otherwise, she argued, a person just becomes a machine. Then, she curiously asked him exactly how old he was turning this year. She realized they were actually quite close in age, with only a 3-year difference between them. He repeated it in disbelief, asking if that meant she was only 27. She confirmed it, adding that she would actually be turning 28 next month. And so we learned that the 4th of next month is her birthday, a date he likely won't forget. He was genuinely surprised, and we see him pull out his phone to check the date, July 4th. Today was the 4th, which meant her birthday was exactly 30 days away. He told her that when the day arrived, he would celebrate it with her. A lovely gesture, really. To be honest, Sophie had never actually celebrated her birthday with any of her students before. She thanked him, calling him partner Leo, and then curiously asked when his own birthday was. He replied that his birthday falls in the middle of October, on the 15th. That was still a long way off, but Sophie made a quiet mental note of it anyway. He then asked her which of Makoto Shinkai's films was her absolute favorite. Leo guessed it might be Your Name, considering how popular it was. But she corrected him, saying it was actually 5 centimeters per second. She admitted she had watched that particular film several times over the years. Every time the credits rolled, she felt a strange, lingering emptiness in her chest. She couldn't help but think about how the protagonists never ended up together. It was a shame, and deep down, he felt exactly the same way about it. It's a classic, she noted, and while the story is tragic, that is precisely why it works. It makes it so memorable, she added, as they continued their comfortable chat. The television remained on in the background, though it was just idling on the home screen. She realized that Leo could talk about these things with a surprising amount of natural ease. It was as if she had discovered a whole new world, and Leo just smiled and agreed. After all, Makoto Shinkai's works truly are in a league of their own. She mentioned that she hadn't seen the most recent one, Weathering with You, just yet. However, she had read several reviews suggesting it was a pure, heartfelt romance. It seemed quite different from those typical save-the-world stories we see everywhere else. Leo admitted he had seen those same comments circulating online. He hadn't seen that latest film either, but he planned to watch it very soon. Sophie then suggested that, perhaps, they could watch it together at home another day. That sounded like a plan to him. He never imagined his tutor's taste would be so similar to everyone else's. He assumed that, for today at least, there wouldn't be much more to discuss. Sophie agreed, thinking that their shared interest probably wouldn't exceed 50 specific things. She noted that since they were now living under the same roof, things couldn't stay as they were. Otherwise, living together would become quite exhausting for both of them. It was true. Before this, he had barely spoken a word to her outside of lessons. Consequently, there was still so much he didn't know. Sophie looked at him thoughtfully. In that moment, we can see that the distance between them had finally begun to shrink. She told him that if partner Leo treated her like a genuine friend, they would surely become very close during their time spent together. He felt this was a great benefit, as being locked away together isn't something everyone experiences. He smiled and nodded, feeling that this transition was much easier than he had imagined. As for Sophie, she realized Leo was far more capable than she remembered him being. Sophie glanced at the clock and saw it was already past 11 in the evening. Sophie then suggested that Leo should stay and watch television for a while. She told him she would prepare the food and he should call her if he needed anything. She stood up and headed into the kitchen, closing the glass door behind her. Leo watched her go and smiled, feeling the pressure finally begin to lift. The tension had truly faded away, especially now that he knew they shared so many interests. Just as he was about to take out his tablet to draw, his phone suddenly rang. It was a message from his inseparable friend, Will, who apparently considered himself quite the heartthrob. Will was anxious to know if the tutor was with him and if she had scolded him last night. He was terrified that she might actually withhold his degree after everything that happened. He begged Leo to respond quickly, as he was feeling incredibly nervous about the whole situation. Leo glanced toward the kitchen, where Sophie was busy chopping vegetables for their meal. He told Will to calm down, noting that he couldn't answer a barrage of questions all at once. He also couldn't help but comment on how laid back Will seemed to be, despite his supposed worry. After all, it was already noon before he even bothered to ask. Will admitted he had only just woken up. Apparently, after hearing the tutor was angry, he was too worried to sleep, so he played games all night. He had only just woken up at 11, which, to be honest, was a bit embarrassing even for him. Leo told him that if he wanted to play games, he should just do it without making up excuses. He informed his friend that the tutor was currently in the kitchen cooking lunch. He hadn't asked about the degree yet, but he didn't think there would be any real problem. Sophie wasn't the type of person to withhold a degree without a very good reason, after all. Will didn't believe it for a second, certain that she must have heard him insulting her the night before. He was confused by Leo's tone, assuming the tutor hadn't actually scolded him at all. Leo reassured him, explaining that Sophie was actually being quite kind and pleasant. Will asked if he had gone mad or was perhaps suffering from some sort of hallucination. He couldn't believe Leo hadn't spent the entire night being lectured and insulted. Leo realized his friend thought he'd been driven crazy, so he decided it was best to just play along. He told Will that she'd only insulted him a few times before heading off to bed. It wasn't a big deal, he noted, though he had to admit their tutor was certainly beautiful. Will warned him about her explosive temper, saying he truly pitied Leo for having to live under the same roof. Leo felt he was exaggerating, even though Sophie had a reputation in class for her short fuse. She had never been angry with him, perhaps because of that stray cat incident back in her first year. We see him watch Sophie as she cooks, her profile looking like something out of a painting. Her long hair fell over her shoulder, and once again, he found himself struck by her grace and beauty. Will messaged again, insisting that no matter how terrifying she was, Leo had to do him a favor. He desperately needed Leo to take the trouble to ask her about the status of his degree. He wanted her to know he was truly sorry and had spent the whole time reflecting on his mistake. If the degree was safe, he promised to treat Leo to a proper dinner once he was out. Leo agreed, telling him he understood and would find a moment to ask her in a little while. Will begged him to go right now, claiming he wouldn't even be able to eat until he had an answer. After all, with all the neighborhoods currently on lockdown, there wasn't much else to do anyway. Will promised to treat him to 2 hot pot dinners, calling Leo his absolute best friend in the world. He felt his entire future depended on this, sounding quite resigned to his fate. Leo agreed to the deal, confirming that 2 hot pot dinners would be the price for his help. He told Will he would go ask her right then and to wait for his update. Will was beyond grateful, practically bowing through the phone in a show of deep respect. After putting his phone away, Leo watched Sophie as she busied herself in the kitchen. After a brief moment of hesitation, he stood up and made his way toward her. As he opened the kitchen door, Sophie turned around to see what he needed. Her voice was surprisingly soft as she asked him what was on his mind. To be honest, she looked nothing like the fierce monster Will had described earlier. The difference was striking, and Leo simply smiled, initially claiming it was nothing at all. Sophie looked confused, wondering why he had come into the kitchen if there was no reason. She encouraged him to speak his mind and just say whatever he was thinking directly. So, he decided to tell her the truth that Will had just messaged him about last night. He explained that Will wanted to apologize, but at the mention of his name, things changed. We see Sophie's expression darken slightly, a shadow crossing her face at the reminder. Her smile vanished as she turned back to her tomatoes, her tone becoming flat and distant. She questioned why, if he truly wanted to apologize, he hadn't just called her himself. She knew exactly what was happening. Will was only worried about the status of his degree. She glanced at Leo over her shoulder, knowing he had been sent as a mere messenger. She asked if he was simply checking to see if she would still send the diploma, which was exactly the case. Leo swallowed hard, feeling an inexplicable pressure weighing down on him in that quiet kitchen. She told him to tell Will to stay calm, as she would be sending it out right on time. He nodded softly in response, though it was clear to us that she wasn't happy at all. She placed the sliced tomatoes into a bowl and began preparing the egg mixture with practiced ease. With her back still turned to him, she suddenly asked Leo about the general impression people had of her. She wondered aloud if she truly had a bad temper, or if many people spoke ill of her behind her back. Leo rushed to explain, insisting that he personally thought she was a very good person. However, he admitted it was also true that some people whispered about her having a difficult temperament. While beating the eggs, she glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, searching for his true thoughts. She asked if Leo also believed that she suffered from a bad temper. He quickly denied it, telling her that in his eyes, she was actually quite different. He told her she was quite kind, which caused Sophie to offer a tight-lipped smile as she thanked him. She admitted that what the other students said wasn't entirely wrong, to be perfectly honest. She confessed her character could be a bit difficult at times, but she always had her reasons. After all, not every student she encountered was as pleasant and easy to deal with as Leo. She noted that some people simply refuse to listen if you speak to them kindly. Leo understood perfectly, realizing she was referring to the more disruptive students in the class. She nodded in agreement and turned on the stove to begin heating the pan. In university, a tutor's role isn't quite as vital as in primary school, but she still took it seriously. Even so, she still had to manage the class, noting that for some students, speaking kindly simply didn't work. They only listen once they realize you aren't someone who can be intimidated. Only then do they obey. Otherwise, life can be difficult for a female professor in her position. She mentioned she wasn't married, and if she were mistreated, she had no one to stand up for her. She said it with such casual indifference that Leo couldn't help but feel a wave of understanding for her. Regarding what Will had said the day before, she admitted she had been quite angry the previous night. If he were still in school, she would have certainly had words with him, but he had already graduated. She wouldn't withhold his degree, as teachers are often the ones who most want their students to graduate smoothly. She sighed while looking at him, expressing her hope that they would all eventually stand out in society. This was the message she wanted Leo to pass along to Will on her behalf. She assured him that she would continue to provide updates regarding the degree on time. It would be delivered without issue or special treatment, so he shouldn't overthink the situation. She smiled, wondering why she had suddenly shared so much with Leo when she hadn't even spoken to Will yet. She told Leo to just consider it the rambling of a tired teacher and not to give it much thought. Leo sensed she felt wronged. After all, she had done so much for the class over the years. To be scolded right at graduation would make anyone emotional, which was perfectly understandable. He told her not to worry and promised he would go speak with Will immediately. He explained that Will simply had a bit of a strange personality, but he wasn't a bad person at heart. Once he mentioned the news about the degree, he was certain Will would give her a call. With that, he stepped out of the kitchen and headed to the balcony to ring Will. As soon as the call connected, Will asked hurriedly how everything had gone. He wanted to know what the counselor said, while Leo glanced back at Jane cooking and began to explain. He told him that the counselor wouldn't withhold his degree and that it would be delivered normally. Will let out a long sigh of relief, repeatedly saying how lucky that was. He remarked that the counselor could be quite kind sometimes, and was surprised she hadn't even gotten angry. Leo agreed it was good she wasn't upset, but suggested that Will should still give her a call. Will admitted that what he said the previous night was just a joke told without thinking. He realized Leo was right and that he needed to apologize, otherwise he'd be too embarrassed to call again. He wouldn't even dare show his face at future reunions, so he asked one last time if she was truly okay. Leo told him to relax, and with that, Will hung up to go make the call to the counselor. Returning to the sofa, we see Jane answering her phone while she continues to fry the food. She spoke in the kitchen with a hint of annoyance that quickly melted into a smile. After a few brief sentences, she hung up and went right back to her cooking. Leo then sent a quick message to Will to check in on how the conversation went. Will replied that everything was fine and that the counselor seemed to be in a surprisingly good mood today. Leo felt relieved that the matter was settled, but then his thoughts turned to more practical concerns. To be perfectly honest, he was starting to run quite low on money. If the lockdown prevented him from leaving, he decided he would have to start looking for work by the day after tomorrow. He hoped Will wouldn't blame him for not waiting, as it had become an inevitable necessity. When asked what kind of job he had in mind, he decided he would simply start with a few interviews to see. He planned to take whatever came up in the interviews, telling Will they'd celebrate with a feast once the lockdown ended and he had some cash. Will promised to treat him to a great meal later, before signing off to go play some games. Leo decided he would make the most of these next 2 days to finally rank up in his own game. By noon, Jane had finished her work in the kitchen and called him over for lunch. It was the same routine as before, though this time, he finally had a brand new towel of his own. At the table, she handed him the chopsticks. He thanked her, but as he looked at the dishes, he saw it was once again scrambled eggs with tomatoes. To be honest, he was momentarily stunned by the repetition. Noticing his hesitation, she asked a bit awkwardly if something was wrong or if he was already tired of this particular dish. He quickly took a bite to reassure her. He insisted it wasn't that, as the counselor's eggs and tomatoes were actually quite delicious. But he admitted there was a question he had been wanting to ask her for a while now. It seemed she had already guessed what he was thinking, as a slight blush crept onto her face. He simply asked if she was particularly fond of tomatoes and eggs. Jane gave him a strange look before lowering her head and letting out a soft laugh. She remarked that he certainly had a subtle way of pointing things out. She confessed that while she liked the dish, the real reason was that it was the only thing she knew how to cook. Usually, she ate at the school or ordered delivery at home, so her skills in the kitchen were, shall we say, limited. Leo nodded, realizing his suspicion had been correct all along. Jane thought for a moment and noted that since she had plenty of free time during the day now, she could try to learn new recipes. But unfortunately, the fridge was currently stocked with nothing but tomatoes and eggs. Leo swallowed hard before offering a suggestion. What if he took over the cooking duties starting tonight? Jane looked surprised, asking if he actually knew how to cook, so he took a moment to explain. He reminded her that he never said he couldn't. He had mentioned yesterday that he knew his way around a kitchen. Jane wore a curious expression as he told her that whenever he was home, he was the one who prepared the meals. He asked if that made sense to her, and she nodded thoughtfully, considering the possibility. She laughed softly, noting that while she understood, the fridge was still strictly limited to tomatoes and eggs. Even with talent, she doubted much could be done, but he wondered if those two ingredients were truly so limited. He gave her a confident smile and suggested they just wait and see, which made her chuckle. He urged her to finish her lunch first and promised to show off his skills after her afternoon nap. She agreed, and we can see that the counselor was becoming quite curious about his hidden talents. And so, after they finished eating, Jane spent the entire afternoon resting comfortably. Around 6 in the evening, she finally emerged into the living room, still in her slippers. She was absolutely stunned to find that he had turned those basic ingredients into 3 distinct dishes, including a delicate egg custard. There was also a savory soup and even a pasta dish topped with a rich, flavorful sauce. Technically, it was still just tomatoes and eggs, but the appearance and aroma were entirely different. Leo stepped out of the kitchen to find Jane standing there, completely speechless. He found her reaction rather amusing and greeted her, noting that she was finally awake. He presented the 3 dishes and asked for her opinion while she stared at the table in disbelief. She couldn't believe he had done all of this alone and demanded to know how it was even possible. He simply headed to the bathroom to wash his hands, knowing that explaining the secret would be far too complicated. He suggested she try it first to see how it tastes, promising to explain his secrets only if she enjoyed the meal. And so, Jane nodded slightly, picked up a spoon, and took her first cautious bite. As the flavors hit her, a look of pure surprise washed over her face, and she admitted it was actually quite good. She remarked that it felt like a dessert, wondering aloud if such a thing could really be made with just eggs. Leo confirmed that eggs were indeed enough, explaining that the real secret lay in filtering out the air bubbles. To be honest, he made it sound quite simple, as if anyone could achieve such results with a bit of patience. She took another bite, looking up at him with a newfound sense of wonder in her eyes. She confessed it was truly delicious, having had no idea that eggs could be transformed into something so refined. Curious, she asked where he had learned such skills, and he simply replied that he was self-taught. He explained that he usually just looks up tutorials online and practices a few times until he gets it right. He then encouraged her to try the pasta, and with a smile, she nodded in agreement. She switched to a fork to twirl the noodles, and after tasting them, she covered her mouth with her hand, laughing in delight. She told him it was wonderful, calling him truly incredible for pulling off such a feat. She wondered how he knew such recipes, and he explained that back in his hometown, things were a bit different. He used to cook basic homemade dishes every day until he eventually grew bored of the same old flavors. That boredom led him to spend his free time browsing the internet without much of a plan. And that, as it turns out, was how he picked up a few extra skills, leaving her deeply impressed by his initiative. When she asked if he only knew a little, he gave a modest shrug, though Jane stared at him with clear skepticism. With a faint smile, she told him he was being far too modest for someone with his obvious talent. She joked that if he ever said he knew just a little again, she would simply translate that to mean he was an expert. Leo took a bit of the egg custard for himself, teasing Jane that she was surely exaggerating about how good it was. He noted that if the dish was to her liking, they should eat, remembering how sleepy she had seemed earlier that afternoon. She nodded and chewed slowly, though it was clear her appetite was much stronger now than it had been at noon. After quickly finishing what was on her plate, she looked longingly at the very last remains of the pasta. He asked if she was full yet, and she pursed her lips, nodded, and then spoke with a hint of caution. She admitted she wasn't quite full yet and asked if Leo would mind making another serving of the custard. She even suggested that perhaps they could make it together this time. She asked if he would teach her, and for a moment, Leo found her request to be quite charming. There was something adorable about the contrast between her sophisticated appearance and this sudden earnestness. It was a strange reversal. Usually, he was the one seeking her advice, but now the roles had shifted. As her bright eyes remained fixed on him, he couldn't help but think how incredibly striking she looked. She broke the silence, asking why he had suddenly gone quiet and what he was thinking about. He snapped back to reality, feeling a flush of heat rise to his cheeks for no apparent reason. Seeing him staring, she instinctively bit her lip, perhaps feeling a bit self-conscious herself. He hurried to reply, assuring her it would only take about 10 minutes to prepare another batch. Since the custard is so quick to make, he suggested they get started right away. They decided to clear the table first before heading back into the kitchen area. We see them stand up at the exact same time, moving in perfect, unspoken harmony. Leo carried the dishes to the kitchen while she wiped down the table and went to rinse the cloth. She returned to the kitchen, thinking to herself that while a man who can cook isn't rare, he was certainly special. But the fact that he did it so well both surprised and delighted her. She had often imagined a future where a partner would care for her, making the act of cooking together feel far more meaningful. Leo took the eggs from the fridge and asked Jane, his advisor, to help him find 2 small bowls. She responded with a soft hum of agreement and quickly produced the bowls he needed. As she obediently helped, Leo began the process of beating the eggs in one of the small bowls. He added a pinch of salt to the eggs and began whisking them steadily with a pair of chopsticks. While he went to heat the water, Jane nodded and took over the task of holding the small bowl. Out of habit, she began whisking the eggs in a circular motion, which, as we know, was her first mistake. Leo filled the pot with water, but when he turned back, he stopped to watch her technique. He stepped closer and whispered that for a perfect egg custard, one must never whisk in circles. He showed her how to move the chopsticks horizontally instead, guiding her through the proper motion. Jane looked up at him, repeating the word horizontally, as if she were learning a secret spell. He nodded, jokingly reminding her that they were making custard, not a bowl of soup. The horizontal motion breaks the yolk just right, a fact she acknowledged with a quiet, "Oh, I see." Our new student gave it a try, and to be honest, she was a natural at it. Seeing how quickly she learned, Leo turned his attention back to the water, which was almost ready. He grabbed a ladle for the warm water and asked Jane to set the bowl down on the table. He began adding the hot water slowly, warning her to be careful not to burn herself. Then, he decided to test her knowledge, asking her exactly how much water they should be using. She didn't miss a beat, noting it was a 1-to-1 ratio and that the temperature shouldn't be too high. If the water is too hot, the eggs will cook prematurely. If it's too cold, they won't dissolve properly. Warm water is just right, and after the initial mixing, a bit more hot water can be added. Once the mixture is ready, the next crucial step is to pass it through a fine strainer. Leo grabbed a small strainer from the shelf, knowing that filtering it once makes all the difference. He looked at her and asked what the actual purpose of this step was. Jane watched him with a curious smile, noting how the bubbles disappeared through the mesh. This way, the egg custard comes out looking far more complete and appetizing. It was exactly as our advisor said. It would have a texture similar to a delicate cake. He nodded, genuinely surprised by her knowledge. It was quite impressive, to be honest. He told her that she seemed to know an awful lot about this particular dish. She modestly replied that it wasn't a big deal. It was simply a matter of practice over time. At first, she had only found the process amusing, but her perspective had clearly shifted. She thought it was a useful skill for the future, making life easier when living alone in the city. And if he ever had a girlfriend, he could certainly surprise her with his skills from time to time. At the mention of a girlfriend, she glanced at him, imagining what kind of partner he would be. She wondered just how much he would spoil someone. For now, this was enough. Now it was time for the steaming process, and he followed her closely over to the pot. He asked if it was ready, and she confirmed she had only added clear water for the steam. She explained that after steaming, they would need to add a splash of soy sauce. A bit of sesame oil or seasoned fish sauce would provide the perfect finishing touch. But those additions, as we know, are entirely a matter of personal taste. She mentioned that she usually only adds a small amount of the first 2. The egg custard, after all, possesses its own natural sweetness. She placed the 2 bowls into the pot, and Leo carefully set the lid in place. To cook the custard properly, one must use a low flame and leave a tiny opening. It cannot be completely sealed, otherwise, those dreaded bubbles will begin to form. He let out a soft breath and adjusted the lid just a fraction. He was being quite meticulous, asking if that was the correct way to do it. When he asked about the time, she told him it would take 10 to 15 minutes. She checked her phone. It was 6:15, meaning they would open it at 6:25 sharp. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait, so they headed to the bathroom to wash up. In that small, confined space, they found themselves standing very close together. As they washed their hands, their fingers brushed against each other several times. That brief physical contact made them both suddenly, acutely aware of one another. They both kept their faces perfectly calm, though their hearts were racing, naturally. Afterward, they sat at the table and kept a watchful eye on the kitchen. Leo spoke first, asking Jane if the community would distribute food if this lasted. He wondered if the management would look after the residents in such a crisis. Otherwise, what would happen to those who hadn't stocked their pantries? He pulled out his phone to check the community group chat for any updates. It turns out that just yesterday, several owners had already raised this very concern. But the higher-ups remained silent, while the community managers claimed food would surely be distributed. They simply didn't know when, a response that was almost laughable under the circumstances. Still, the fact that someone mentioned it was enough for now, especially as more ingredients arrived. Leo promised Jane that he would teach her even more recipes, calling her his advisor. In reality, there were so many delicious home-cooked meals yet to be explored. He offered to prepare them all for her to taste, looking up at her with a warm smile. Jane, playing along, thanked her companion in advance for the culinary lessons to come. The 10 minutes passed quickly, and we see that Leo never once took his eyes off the pot. Jane watched him for a long while before they finally returned to the kitchen to lift the lid. His eyes were shining in that moment, almost as if they were filled with stars. To be honest, she had never seen him look quite so genuinely excited before. He stared at the trembling egg custard, clearly delighted with how it had turned out. She put on her gloves to take it out, adding a touch of sesame oil and soy sauce. They returned to the table, where he carefully took a small bite and placed it in his mouth. Despite his usually cold demeanor, the way he bit the spoon was unexpectedly adorable. He closed his eyes with a satisfied smile, swallowed, and looked back at her. It was good. He continued taking tiny spoonfuls, as if he never wanted the dish to end. Jane, on the other hand, ate quickly, finishing her portion in just 2 or 3 bites. She suddenly remembered what he had said at noon, addressing her once more as his advisor. He suddenly asks why she decided to come to this city to work as a teacher. Leo chews his custard and looks at her, wondering if she also graduated here. She explains that while she studied in the South, she did attend high school in this city. He seems curious about her school years, and she nods, as the story isn't complicated. She tells him that her old high school was called the Eugene Institute. Due to local policy changes last year, that private school was unfortunately forced to close. However, she still holds a very strong memory of it because of a teacher she deeply respected. The education was standard, but this teacher had a way of making every lesson feel alive. He was always joking with them and truly cared about what the students had to say. Because of his unique approach, many students who had been falling behind found the motivation to improve their grades thanks to that one man. Jane then remembers a specific detail and notes that he might not know the teacher's name, but he would certainly recognize the name of the massive company where the man worked. The Zenith Group. His name was Frank, the father of the company's current general manager. The Zenith Group? Of course he knows it. It is the largest conglomerate in the region. Their comic book publishing division is the biggest in the country, a true titan of industry. And to be honest, that is exactly where Leo has always dreamed of signing a contract. Leo looks at her in surprise, and she can tell he is very familiar with the company. She smiles, knowing this proves just how incredible her old teacher really was. On the surface, he was just a teacher, but in reality, he was the head of a major corporation. When Leo first learned the man's true identity, he was completely stunned. But it's a shame, really, to think it has been years since Jane last had any contact with Professor Frank. She mentions hearing that he isn't in the city anymore, having left to travel the world. Given how grave the global situation is now, he is likely stuck in some distant country, unable to move. Leo assumes this Professor Frank must be quite elderly by now, doesn't he? He calculates that the man must be somewhere between 70 and 80 years old. Jane recalls that on her high school graduation day, his hair was already white, though he still looked quite robust. She looks at Leo and asks, almost as an afterthought, if he would ever like to be a teacher himself. He is momentarily taken aback, admitting that he was never particularly good at his studies. Besides, he never bothered to get a teaching certificate during his years at the university. Jane considers this for a moment, having originally thought that if Leo were willing, he could have been an art teacher, even if those positions are rare and often unstable. However, she suggests that if Leo ever becomes a famous artist, he could return to the school to give a few guest lectures. The school would certainly welcome him with open arms. Becoming famous seems impossible to him, but Jane simply smiles with a deep, knowing look. Finishing the last of her custard, she remarks that one can never be too sure about such things. Who knows what the future holds? When that day comes, she might be the one bragging about knowing him. Leo feels she is flattering him far too much. After dinner and cleaning up, Jane heads to the bedroom to work. Meanwhile, Leo stays in the living room, continuing to draw his serialized comic. Around 11 o'clock, Jane finally finishes her work and begins putting her documents away. Standing at the bedroom door, Leo told her he was turning off the lights to sleep. He warned Jane not to stay up too late either, and she stood up to answer him. She agreed, but Leo quickly asked her to wait just one more moment. We see him head to the corner of the living room to unplug a hot water bottle he had prepared. He handed it to her, thinking it might soothe her if her stomach bothered her during the night. He told her to wake him if she couldn't sleep, promising he would still be awake himself. He was certain he would hear her. Jane looked down at the hot water bottle in silence. She took the warm bottle, nodded, and softly thanked Leo for his thoughtfulness. He told her to rest well, mentioning that he would be heading to bed shortly as well. Jane simply nodded and wished Leo a good night, which, to be honest, was well deserved. Leo returned the wish, and soon the main light in the living room was clicked off. The main bedroom light followed, leaving only a small, dim lamp glowing at the edge of the room. Jane locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, lost in her own thoughts. Holding the warm bottle against her stomach, she felt an indescribable softness in her heart. She lowered her head and wondered to herself if this boy truly had never had a girlfriend. She was beginning to doubt it. She removed her outer layers and finally lay down in bed. But even as she hugged the warm bottle, sleep refused to come to her. Her mind was like a film on repeat, replaying everything that had happened since that morning. She remembered Leo serving her water and the awkward moment he saw her laundry while searching for the bottle. She thought of the trouble with Mike and the simple joy of cooking and chatting together. Some things simply shouldn't be overthought, because if you dwell on them, problems inevitably arise. She wondered why she let him feed her the second time. She clearly could have held the glass herself. And why? She asked herself. Did she feel such intense embarrassment when he saw her laundry? Then there was the matter of Mike. Why on earth had she told Leo about that? Deep down, she wanted him to take her side, but she also realized she unconsciously admired him a little, mostly due to his talent as a comic artist. Why did he seem to know so much more than her? It was only their second day together. Why was everything feeling so intense already? Was it because she knew he liked her? Jane whispered to the dark ceiling, but she remained uncertain. Did she actually like Leo? And if he truly liked her, when exactly did those feelings begin? Perhaps it was years ago, starting with that incident involving the stray cat. We return to a memory from 4 years ago, during the enrollment day for new students. She had spotted a stray cat trapped helplessly inside a sewer drain. A young man was crouching there, lost in thought about how to rescue the poor creature. She had rushed over to help, even bringing some milk for the frightened cat. Eventually, she went to find the staff to ensure the cat was safely rescued. The boy had arrived late to class, and as it turned out, he was actually her student. She decided to turn a blind eye to his tardiness. That boy was Leo, and it was all because of that day. She had always maintained a good impression of him, often speaking to him with a certain sweetness. She wondered if it was because she usually spoke to him in such a soft, gentle tone. It was difficult to guess the truth, but suddenly, her eyes lit up with a new realization. The reader group. Of course, the reader group was the answer. Leo had no idea she was his fan, and she wondered if she could use that secret identity to get some information. It was certainly better than lying there overthinking everything, wasn't it? She switched on her desk lamp, grabbed her phone, and logged into the graduation season fan site. We see her enter the official fan group, which, at this hour, was completely silent. It was already 12:30 in the morning, and she had no way of knowing if he had already fallen asleep. To test the waters, she first sent a simple emoji representing insomnia. She asked if anyone else was awake, and soon a member replied that they weren't exactly suffering from insomnia. Rather, their boss was a nightmare who had forced them to work overtime. The user was exhausted and suggested that if Jane couldn't sleep, she should follow Brother Wee's method. The advice was simple: just close your eyes and force yourself to sleep, and that was that. They also warned her not to count sheep. Apparently, the more you count, the hungrier you get. Instead of sleeping, you end up gaining weight from a late-night lamb feast, which is a fair point, really. It was a lose-lose situation, so Jane thanked them for the warning. We hadn't spoken yet. Perhaps he was already asleep, or maybe he was still busy drawing. She decided to message the group manager directly, asking if he was still awake. Jane stared at the screen with a touch of nervousness, waiting for a sign of life. Half a minute later, Leo finally replied. He explained he was finishing a draft and had just decided to take a break and check his phone. It seemed he hadn't slept either, despite how late it had become. Leo asked if she always stayed up so late. She replied that she usually slept around 2 in the morning. So for her, it was still quite early. Jane bit her lip as she typed her response. She warned him that staying up late wasn't good for his health and would certainly ruin his skin. Leo read the message and laughed, thinking that as a man, he didn't care about skincare, but he played along anyway. He thanked his dear little sister for the concern, but explained there was simply no other way. As most manga artists lived exactly like this, it was an occupational hazard, really. He told her he could only catch up on sleep during the day and use skincare products to keep up appearances. Jane watched the screen with a knowing smile on her face as the messages popped up. Skincare products? She thought he was doing a remarkably good job of pretending to be a big sister. If she hadn't discovered his true identity the day before, she would still be fooled by him every single day. She decided it was time to unmask his true gender to make their future conversations a bit more honest. However, she had to do it in private. She couldn't go ruining his pretty girl image in the public group. She opened a private chat and realized she needed to add him as a friend first. Since her account had no photos, she quickly modified her info, setting her age to a youthful 18. She swapped her profile background for something cuter, posing as a mature older sister herself. He certainly wouldn't expect this. Meanwhile, Leo was lying on the sofa when he saw the friend request. He stared at it in confusion for a moment. To be honest, he already had dozens of pending requests. He chose to ignore them in silence. Jane waited for a long while before finally sending a second request. In the note, she mentioned she had something important to tell the manager and asked him to accept. Only then did he hit accept. She frowned, thinking that this boy was surprisingly cautious with his privacy. Jane started by asking why it took him so long to accept her request. Leo explained that it wasn't personal. He simply received far too many friend requests on a daily basis. Unless there was a very specific reason, he generally ignored them all as a rule. After all, hitting the friend limit would make cleaning out the list later a massive headache. Jane teased him, noting that it seemed their manager was quite popular indeed. He insisted that wasn't the case, as most people just added him and never actually spoke. He then asked his dear little sister if there was something specific she wanted to discuss. Jane admitted she did, though she hoped he wouldn't be angry once he heard it. He promised he wouldn't be and told her to go ahead, so she took a deep breath. She asked him directly if he was, in fact, actually a boy. Jane bit her lip without even realizing it, her heart racing as she waited. She was nervous about his reaction and worried that if he ever discovered her own secret, her professional image as a teacher would be completely ruined, which, naturally, was a terrifying thought. On the other side of the screen, Leo blinked several times in pure shock. He wondered how on earth she could have seen through his persona so easily. It made no sense to him, so he decided to stand his ground and play dumb. He argued that since he drew romance manga, there was no way he could be a guy. But Jane countered that his stories were written almost entirely from a male perspective. Leo pointed out that many female authors used a male perspective in their work as well. However, Jane noted there were certain feminine details in the art that he didn't quite get right. Jane concluded that, based on these observations, her manager couldn't possibly be a girl. As Leo read the second half of her message, his curiosity was piqued despite himself. He asked her which feminine details specifically were wrong and where he had made mistakes. Jane began to explain in detail, using the protagonist, who happened to be a teacher, as an example. She noted that while putting on a shirt isn't much different for a man or a woman, when putting on a t-shirt, a woman doesn't tie her hair in a ponytail before pulling it on. In reality, she explained, a woman pulls the entire shirt over her head first, and only then does she pull her hair out from inside the collar, tossing it back. Leo was stunned, asking if there was more, while Jane pointed out that even his spicier content in the teacher's manga was surprisingly conservative when it came to the details of her lingerie. She told him that a single woman, upon arriving home, does more than just change her shoes. She also takes off her bra immediately, rather than wearing it the entire time she's at home. Behind his screen, Leo's eyes widened in disbelief at this sudden revelation. He countered by asking what she would do if guests arrived, to which Jane replied she'd simply put it back on. Jane smiled on the other side of the phone. Discussing this with her student felt a bit strange, but to win his trust and prove her point, she felt the sacrifice was well worth it. She argued that a single woman in a big city rarely expects unannounced visitors anyway. One simply locks the door, gets comfortable, and goes about their business, which makes sense, really. Unless she's ordered takeout, of course, in which case she waits for the delivery before relaxing. Leo swallowed hard, realizing that, when he thought about it, her logic was actually flawless. Leo realized that his protagonist, Chloe, was a woman who lived entirely alone, who would even visit her. Still, the detail about removing a bra immediately upon arriving home was news to him. And to be perfectly honest, it was a detail he had rarely, if ever, seen in other manga. While scenes of characters removing their stockings were common enough, he knew he needed to be more precise for both his leads.